Hey, what's up guys? Welcome back to another episode in the Spring series. In this episode, I'm going to show you how to code to an interface. So far, we've got a lot of practice making beans using the Spring framework and injecting them into other beans. So now I want to show you what's called coding to an interface. So I've got a little diagram here for you guys just to try and illustrate what we're going to do this episode and the next episodes after this. So let's say that we have a public transportation service. And this is just a simple service class that is responsible for getting a vehicle from point A to point B. It's like a public transportation service, right? So it's just going to be provided a vehicle by the vehicle provider service, okay? And let's say that this vehicle provider service, you just call a method and it returns a vehicle object to the public transportation service. And then the public transportation service will start transporting that vehicle from point A to point B. That's as simple as it works. But then let's say that we have different types of vehicles that we want to provide from the vehicle provider service. So what we'll do in this case is we'll make a vehicle provider service an interface. So you're defining what a vehicle provider service will do in general. And then you can have classes or services that implement that interface, and they can choose how they want to provide the code, how they want to implement the code defined by the interface. So let's say that you have a vehicle provider service, you need it, it's a dependency for your public transportation service, and you have different types of vehicle provider services, like a taxi provider service that's going to provide taxis, a train provider service provides trains, and a bus provider service provides buses. So what we want to try and achieve is that whenever we create our public transportation service, we're not telling it in the code in our field. We don't want to tell it that the dependency is like a set concrete class like a train provider service or a taxi provider service. We want to tell it that the dependency is a vehicle provider service, even though that's an interface. Because what we can do is we can have Spring automatically inject the service implementation that we want it to provide. So let's say that for some reason our public transportation service needs a taxi provider service. We can tell public transportation service that it has a dependency of vehicle provider service, the interface. And so Spring Container, when it creates the public transportation service bean, it will know, there's different ways to tell it which one you're looking for, but let's say that we have a config option somewhere that tells it we want to use the taxi provider service by default. So Spring, when it creates the public transportation service bean, it will find the taxi provider service bean, and since it implements the vehicle provider service dependency type, it will inject the taxi provider service into the public transportation service bean. So these are going to be beans as well. So your vehicle provider service interface is not going to be a bean itself. It's just simply defining the contract of what a vehicle provider service should do. But these classes here should be beans themselves, because of course, to inject a dependency into a client bean, you have to have the dependencies themselves as beans, right? So just have these beans present within your Spring container, and Spring will handle injecting them into the public transportation service. So this might not make a lot of sense since we haven't jumped into the code or anything like that, but in short, you're just telling Spring that you have a public transportation service bean, and the dependency of this bean is a vehicle provider service interface type. So then when the Spring container creates this public transportation service bean, it will determine which implementation of the vehicle provider service to inject into the public transportation service, provided that these are beans themselves and that they do implement the vehicle provider service. But the reason that we want to do this is that we can easily swap out which implementations we want depending on the needs that we have. So let's say that you have a website where you have different types of databases and you have different services that implement those databases in different ways. So if you want to switch between database implementations, you can switch between your services just by having a single interface that defines a generalized contract for those methods for that service. So the key thing behind this is swappability, and we're going to see how we can do that and achieve that using the Spring framework, okay? So let's go ahead and code this little infrastructure here, and then we're going to see how we can let Spring Container choose which one to provide in the next few episodes. All right, I'm back. I got a new project here, so let's go ahead and set it up. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create our public transportation service. So this will be our client bean that requires a vehicle provider service. So it's going to be responsible for transporting vehicles to their destination, okay? So public transportation service. Cool. And we're going to annotate this as a service. because we want it to be managed by Spring as a bean, and also we want to be able to inject stuff into it using Spring, and it has to be a service, as we know from last episode and the episodes before that. So this public transportation service will have two methods. It'll have start trip and end trip. So to start the trip, well, first of all, we're going to need the vehicles that we want to transport, right? Because obviously this is a vehicle transportation service. We're going to be providing vehicles to it. So we need to define what a vehicle is. So let's go ahead and make a new package here. We'll make one called services, and we're just going to put this public transportation service within that. There we go. So we have some order here and structure. And then we're going to have a new package called model. So this model package will just define a class called vehicle. Okay, cool. Now we have to decide what a vehicle is going to have within our code here. So a vehicle, it should have a unique identifier, and we can use that. We can do that using a UUID. So UUID, which is, if you don't know, it's a universally unique identifier, I believe. Yeah, universally unique identifier. So it's just a random ID that you can generate for in Java, essentially. So we're just going to call this registration number, because that makes sense in terms of vehicles and stuff like that. And the other field that we're going to have is a vehicle type. So since we're going to have trains, we're going to have buses, we're going to have taxis, we want to have it discern which type of vehicle this is. So private vehicle type. So let's go ahead and define what a vehicle type is. So create class vehicle type. Actually, we want this to be an enumeration. So model new Java class enum, and we're going to call it vehicle type. There we go. And so within this, we're just going to define some of the vehicle types that we're going to use within this project. So in this case, bus, taxi, and train. There we go. So now we can import this here. Great, looks good to me. Now let's create a constructor to define these or set these variables once the object is created. So public vehicle type, UUID, registration number. This dot type is equal to type. This dot registration number is equal to registration number. Great. And then of course, don't forget your getters and setters so we can access them. So getters and setters, there we go. Awesome. So there we go. We have a very simple plain old Java object that just defines what a vehicle is. So now we can use this vehicle within our public transportation service. So let's say that we have inside of here a start trip vehicle, or a method, sorry. So we'll do public vehicle, and you'll see why we're returning vehicle in a second. Start trip. Now we want to obtain a vehicle to start the trip for, right? We need to be provided a vehicle, and we're going to do that with our vehicle provider service. So we're going to call upon the vehicle provider service whenever we want to, for example, in the start trip method, to get a new vehicle, and then we're going to start the trip for that vehicle. So let's go ahead and create a new Java class. We're going to call it vehicle provider service. And this is not going to be an interface, just so we can see how we can make it an interface later on. So first we're going to do it like the regular way without coding to an interface, so that you can see why you might want to code to an interface in your code, because it's a good idea from a design perspective. So inside of the vehicle provider service, obviously we want this to be a service itself, just because we want it to be injected into the public transportation service. And this is going to be really simple. So just public vehicle, it's going to return a new vehicle, get vehicle. And this will just return new vehicle. And we want to provide a vehicle type. So vehicle type will just say taxi by default. And then we'll have a registration number. So UUID dot random UUID. There we go. So now we've generated a new UUID for our vehicle. Great. So now that vehicle is going to be returned from the vehicle provider service. So we can go ahead and use it here. So let's go ahead and define our dependency within here. So public or private final vehicle provider service, and we're going to inject this or auto wire this using constructor injection. So we need a constructor for that. So public transportation service, vehicle provider service, this dot vehicle provider service is equal to vehicle provider service, and then we can annotate this with auto wired so that Spring will know to do constructor dependency injection upon this to provide the dependency of vehicle provider service. And what's the problem here? It says class can be a record. Okay, great. So now that we have a vehicle provider service dependency hopefully injected into this bean here, we can use it. So now we can do vehicle provider service dot get vehicle, and we're going to store that within a variable of vehicle. So vehicle is equal to vehicle provider service dot get vehicle. And then we're going to output a message that says something that we know, so that we know that this trip was started. So we'll say vehicle dot get type dot get toString plus with registration number, and then we're just going to access the registration number from the vehicle object. So vehicle dot get registration number dot toString, because it's a UUID object, and then boom, has left the station. So we can imagine this service existing within a public transportation hub, like I guess a station. And so it'll make sense to just say that the vehicle with registration number 123 blah 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 has left the station, so because it's starting the trip to wherever the destination is. And if you want to expand this even further, then you can just provide a destination object and you can make it more advanced. But we're just trying to show you how to code to an interface. We're not really worried about making this as complex and as realistic as possible, because this is a very, very basic example here. So after that, we do want to return a vehicle object because that is the return type. So return vehicle. Great. So now we have a simple start trip method that calls upon our dependency. So let's go ahead and test this code out to see if it works. So we're going to go to our main method here, and we're going to try obtaining a public transportation service bean. So application context, import that. Great. So now to get the bean, we can do public transportation service. Public transportation service is equal to context.getBean, public transportation service.class. There we go. And now let's try calling the method. So public transportation service dot start trip. Okay, so let's hit run. I just added a run configuration there. And boom, taxi with registration number. And as you can see, this is the UUID as a string. So it's a really unique identifier. Has left the station. Great, looks perfect to me. So that's how, so we know that our code works. That's good. So we can make this, we can keep going. So just to recap, what we did here is that we made a bean here, a public transportation service bean. And within that bean, we have a simple method that calls upon a dependency vehicle provider service that provides a vehicle object for you to use within this client bean here. So we're going to obtain a vehicle and then just tell it in the console that the vehicle has left the station. And yeah, it's being injected by constructor injection because we have the field defined here, and then we have a constructor, and then we have it annotated with auto-wired. Great, so this is all stuff that we know so far. So let's see how we can expand upon this to make it more advanced. First things first is we're going to make a end trip method. So public void end trip. And the reason this is void is because we don't need to return a vehicle since the trip is over. And the reason that we return a vehicle here is because then we could use that same vehicle and provide it into end trip, right? Because it doesn't make sense to ask the dependency for a whole new vehicle to end the trip with, right? Because that would just be a different vehicle, right? We want to end the vehicle's trip that we actually started the trip for. So we're just going to take that vehicle, returned by start trip, and then pass it into end trip when the vehicle trip is over. And then we could say something like, let's just copy this one here. A vehicle with registration blah, blah, blah has arrived at the destination. Great. So let's run the, first we need to use it. So this returns a vehicle. So vehicle is equal to public transportation service dot vehicle. Then we can do public transportation service dot end trip and provide vehicle. There we go. So that's how that works. Now let's run this and see what happens. There we go. So we get taxi with the registration number blah 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 has left the station. Taxi with the registration number blah 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 has arrived at the destination. As you can see, the ID numbers are the same, so it's the same vehicle arriving and leaving the station. Great. Awesome. So that's how that works. But let's say that we want to have different implementations of our vehicle provider service, because currently it only provides a taxi. Let's say that we want a vehicle provider service for buses, for trains, and stuff like that. So what we can do is make this an interface and then have different concrete implementations of our vehicle provider service that implement the get vehicle method. And then they can choose, and then the vehicle transportation service, the public transportation service, can be provided any implementation of that interface, so that, like depending on how you want to use it, you can tell it which service that you want to use. Okay, so let's try that out. Let's change this vehicle provider service. First, let's remove the service annotation because it's no longer going to be a service. It's just going to be an interface that defines a simple method that you have to implement. So public interface vehicle provider service, and now we can get rid of this and we can get rid of the code for it too, because it's just a simple abstract method here that needs to be defined by its implementing classes. So now we can go into services and create a new Java class. We're going to call this one Taxi Provider Service, IMPL. And that IMPL stands for implementation. There's different ways you can tell it, that this is just a interface implementation, but this is the most common one that I see. Just end your concrete classes that extend a interface with IMPL at the end, so that you know that this taxi provider service is a implementing class of a larger vehicle provider service. Okay, so we're going to create that class. Great. And so now we can do implements vehicle provider service. And we have red here because we have not implemented the get vehicle method like we're supposed to. So we can hover over this and do implement methods. Okay. And great. Now here we can do return new vehicle. Return type, vehicle type is taxi, because this is a taxi provider service implementation. And then the registration number will again be just randomly generated for the vehicle. Great. So now we have a taxi provider service implementation of the vehicle provider service interface. So we can go ahead and annotate this with service, because this is a concrete bean that we can allow to be injected into our public transportation service. Great. So let's go back to our public transportation service. And as you can see, it's still using the interface type, and that's perfectly fine, right? We're not doing something like vehicle provider service is equal to new vehicle provider service. That wouldn't make sense, right? Because a vehicle provider service is only an interface. It cannot be instantiated. But because we have this type here, this generalized interface type, any vehicle provider service can be injected into this constructor here. Okay, so Spring will automatically look for vehicle provider service beans that, so beans that implement vehicle provider service. And then if it finds one, it will inject it into the public transportation service. So if we run this, it should automatically do that, because there's only one bean that implements this vehicle provider service interface, and that's what we need for this public transportation service. So let's run this and see what happens. Great, still works. Nothing changed at all. Well, the code changed obviously, but it still works, of course, which is the most important thing. But let's say that we want other different types of provider service implementations, vehicle provider service implementations. Let's say that now we want a bus provider service. So we're going to make a new bus provider service IMPL. And this will implement, again, the vehicle provider service. Great. And now let's define it. So we're going to return new vehicle type bus, and then UUID, random ID. Great, there we go. And this will of course be a service bean itself as well. So now let's run this and see what happens. Okay, so look, we got like a little problem here. It says application failed to start. Description, parameter 0 of constructor in me.codysimpson.coding to an interface.services.public transportation service required a single bean, but 2 were found. Okay, so you may have guessed that this would happen, right? Because we have a public transportation service client bean that requires a vehicle provider service type, there are 2 different types of vehicle provider services, so it doesn't know what to do. There's 2 different beans that implement this interface. So how is it supposed to know which one to choose if we don't tell it, right? So there's different ways that we can tell it, which one to choose. That, like, you can choose it by its name and stuff like that. That's why if you go back to the public transportation service, it's red here because it says it could not auto-wire. There's more than one bean of vehicle provider service. So one way that we can tell it which vehicle provider service that we want to use is just change the name here to the name of the bean itself. So in this case, if we want the bus provider service, we can do bus provider service IMPL. And I told you before when we were creating beans how beans are named. So that's how you know what to put here. So bus provider service implementation. So now Spring will know when it's trying to locate a bean to inject into the public transportation service of the type vehicle provider service, it will know that it's looking for a bus provider service implementation object because of course there's multiple implementations of vehicle provider service. So by default, it doesn't know which one to choose if you don't tell it. So let's run this now and see if it works. Great, there we go. So it says bus, this time bus with registration number blah 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 has left the station, and then bus with registration number blah 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 has arrived at the station. Great. So now we have told it explicitly which vehicle provider service we want to use, and it's easy to swap them out, okay? So let's say that we want to use the taxi provider service. We can just change this to taxi. It's really quite simple, but in the future, in the next episodes, we're going to see how we can do this much easier, by the way. So let's run this now, and it should say taxi. Great, so now it says taxi with registration has left, taxi with registration has arrived. Awesome. So you can swap them out pretty easily using the code here, the constructor parameter name. So before I explain this further, let's go ahead and create a final service here. And we're going to be making a train provider service implementation. Great. So this will implement a vehicle provider service, as you can expect. Implement methods, return new vehicle, vehicle type, train, and then registration number uuid.random uuid. Great, awesome. So at service, and now we can go back. So this is a bean that we've created. So now we have 3 different beans that Spring can use to provide to public transportation service. But currently it's only going to choose the taxi one because we're telling it we want to provide the taxi one. So we can change this to train if you want to. Awesome. There we go. Now it should say train at the bottom. There we go. So train has arrived, train has left. Awesome. So some of the reasons that this is a good idea is because, of course, like I told you before, they're easily swappable. So we've introduced swappability into our loosely coupled client and dependency classes here. So in this case, of course, vehicle provider service is not a class, but they're very loosely coupled in the sense that, of course, you're not, defining a new vehicle provider service within the constructor here, as we saw. That's tight coupling, right? So in this case, it's easily swappable with which implementation you want. If you want a train provider service for some reason for this public transportation service, then you could provide a train provider service. If you want a taxi provider service, you can provide a taxi service. And we're going to see in the next episodes how we can tell Spring which one we want to provide. In this case, this is the most basic way to tell it, but there's way better ways. You don't want to have to edit your code every time you want to change the provider, because let's say that you have many different client classes that require a vehicle provider service, then it would be really stupid and sloppy to have to go to each one of those classes and change the name here. So that would basically remove the benefits of having loose coupling and dependency injection. You would have to still go into each client class and manually edit it, and that's just poopy, right? That's just stupid, right? Another obvious benefit, hopefully this is obvious, is that if you were to change the type of service that is being provided to the public transportation service, it wouldn't change a single thing within your public transportation service. As long as it follows the vehicle provider service interface contract here of providing a vehicle object, it will always work. It won't change. It shouldn't break your client classes. They should work no matter how much you change your taxi provider service implementation class or your bus provider service implementation classes. As long as they follow the interface, it should still work within your client classes. So that's why coding to an interface is also a very good reason, because all you're doing is telling it what you want the service to do within your public transportation service. And then no matter what one you provide, it will get the job done and you don't have to worry about the implementation. So they're swappable, and also when you swap them, they won't break anything. That's really the core of why you want to code to an interface. So anyway, that's pretty much it for that. That's how you can code to an interface within your client classes that require dependency, and you can have different types of those dependencies. You could have different implementations of that dependency that is required, and you're going to see that commonly within Spring applications, within real-world Spring applications, because you're going to have usually there's different implementations of different things for your services, okay? Hopefully you found this very informative. Alright, so that's it for this video. Thanks for watching. In the description below, I'll leave a link to the code for this episode so you can check it out. You can bookmark it, come back to it later. If you forget any concepts or you just want to review the concepts I taught in this video, I'll mark everything up with comments so you can come back and read the code without having to rewatch the video, although your reviews are greatly appreciated. So yeah, I'll leave a link for that in the description below, so make sure to check it out. And another thing is I'll leave a link to our Discord server. It's a big community for programmers. You can ask for help on your programming projects if you're stuck on something, or maybe you can get some new friends. If you don't have any friends, there's lots of people here. It's growing really fast. You can find lots of people who are passionate about the same things as you. For example, if you like Minecraft Spigot development, you can find lots of people who like that. If you like C++, if you like Java, if you like web development, it's a really, really big programming community. So feel free to join. There's a link for that in the description below. And the last thing I want to tell you is that if you want to support this channel, you can click the join button below this video, and you can join this channel as a member for as low as 99 cents a month, and you can cancel at any time. You get some cool perks like early access to all of my new videos, a cool rank on my Discord server like you see right here on the side, YouTube members, and also you get to see yourself on the screen like you see right now. So if that sounds cool to you, feel free to join. If you don't want to, that's fine. If you can't, that's okay too. I really just appreciate you watching the video anyway. And thank you. Thanks a lot. And that's it. So if you like this video, leave a like. If you want to see more, subscribe, and peace.